This is episode 573 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I'm very pleased to be rejoined by Zach Fort. He is currently the legislative affairs manager at the New Mexico Shooting Sports Association and is someone we've had as a guest many times in the past, and with gun rights yet again in the crosshairs, so to speak, in the upcoming legislative session. We welcome Zach back to Tipping Point, New Mexico. So thanks for coming back on.
I appreciate it. It's probably, I don't know how many times I've done this podcast before, but I appreciate the opportunity to come talk about this stuff with you and our and your listeners. Sometimes I may sound like a broken record with, we talk about this stuff because a lot of times we do see similar bills introduced from one year to the next. But I think it's imperative for people to know that this is going to be an ongoing issue. I mean, in California, they have some of the strictest gun control laws in the country, and every single legislative session in California, they have a dozen or more new bills introduced, whether it's some kind of microstamping tax, whatever. Like, it's going to be an issue in this state from going forward. I mean, this issue is not going away in any way, shape, or form. So it's going to continue to be an issue. So we're going to continue to talk about and advocate for our point of view.
Well, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate your taking the time out of your schedule to come and talk to us and share information about these issues, which Rio Grande Foundation is not a gun rights organization. We support the Second Amendment. We support gun rights, but you're dealing with a whole suite and array of issues that you want to be an expert in. You want to have the latest information, and we're pretty busy covering the economy and the education system, and so I have guys like you to tell me what the latest is with guns. And I don't want you to compare New Mexico to California. The hope is that we at least have interludes where we have more conservative, more pro-gun political leadership. I think that bridge has been crossed. The Rubicon has been crossed in California. I don't think they're going to be electing any pro-gun governors, or the legislature is going to shift anytime soon in California. But certainly my hope is that especially in the wake of this uniquely anti-gun governor and pretty anti-gun legislature. We can talk about that, but the state of New Mexico will move in a little more rational perspective. I mean, but I don't know if we talked about it at the time last time we had you on, but of course we had the passing of Bill Richardson,
Mm-hmm.
and he was endorsed at least by the national NRA. He was considered a relatively pro-gun politician. So before we get to this session, talk about the evolution, especially in New Mexico, of the Democratic Party from the days of just Bill Richardson to the current administration and the current legislature, because it's a big shift.
Yeah, and actually, Bill Richardson was, I believe he was endorsed by the National Rifle Association. He wasn't given a great grade, but he was endorsed by them, I believe. Actually, when Gary King ran for governor in New Mexico, I think he had a higher rating from the NRA than Susana Martinez did. That was a little, I guess, fact, kind of a relatively unknown fact. So in New Mexico, and the kind of the rural Democrats who support gun rights in New Mexico, they're still there. There's kind of pockets of them, particularly outside of the larger metropolitan areas. So places like Espanola, places like Gallup, places like Deming, where there's still a lot of Democrats, but those where you typically find, those pro-gun Democrats, those conservative Democrats, and that's a lot of who we work with. Because we've really seen a large shift in kind of the more metropolitan areas, kind of that Rio Grande Valley area from, Santa Fe, Albuquerque, down to Las Cruces, where that's really kind of the nexus of power right now in the Democratic Party. As they've become a lot more progressive, the Democratic Party overall has followed those directions because, they dominate the primaries in that party. and then the majority of the elected officials. I mean, almost all the leadership in the House and the Senate. You know, we have a very heavily Democrat House and Senate here in New Mexico. Pretty much all the leadership is from those areas. You know, Santa Fe, Albuquerque, Las Cruces, and those are much more progressive areas. So they're the ones who really set the tone for the party overall. But we really do work a lot with the conservative Democrats who are still there. And there are still some conservative Democrats in the metropolitan areas that we work with for sure. But really, by and large, it's the progressives have kind of taken over those metropolitan areas and the Democratic politics there. So it limits our ability of who we can work with. But at the same time, you know, we still find opportunities to work with. You know, we still have metro area Republicans in Albuquerque. We still have, you know, I think there's some Republicans who do have parts of Doñana County. And so we continue to work with those people, and then also the Democrats as well. So we can build a coalition to stop bills, but it's a harder coalition than it used to be on some of this stuff as the Democratic Party kind of nationally has shifted on this issue, whereas it was a little bit fuzzier as to, you know, which side people were on. And, you know, nationally there are some anti-gun Republicans, particularly out of the large metropolitan areas like New York City. There's some Republicans there who are very anti-gun. So it's in some ways, gun politics follows kind of that rural-urban divide, where people from the more urban areas tend to be more anti-gun. People from rural areas where firearms, they're a way of life, they're a tool for work, and they're a respect, and those rights are probably better respected in those rural areas. So that's kind of the trend we've really seen, and we kind of see that here in New Mexico as well. I think for the most part, Republicans from the more metropolitan areas in New Mexico, they still tend to be pro-gun, but sometimes, you know, you got to push them a little bit harder than you might have to somebody from, you know, Hobbs or something like that.
Well, I guess we do have one thing to talk about before we get to the session. And, you know, we had you last on to discuss the governor and her public health order on guns. Obviously, part of that fell apart immediately. The most kind of important part, which was the ban on concealed and open carry in the city of Albuquerque, that was eliminated immediately. But there was a court case heard very recently about this use of the public health orders in New Mexico. Essentially, not a Second Amendment issue, but the idea that guns could be a part, or restricting guns could be a part of that public health emergency. Talk about that issue, where you see it going, you know, and any involvement that you have, or the parties that are involved in that, or in that lawsuit.
Yes, a great question. So just for your listeners' information, so I personally and my organization, the Mexico Shooting Sports Association, we are involved in a lawsuit in federal court because we filed basically very, very quickly, almost immediately, right after she issued that order, so we could get that struck down so people could lawfully carry in the city of Albuquerque, as is their right to do so. So we're still pursuing that litigation. It's in federal court. You know, there's been a bunch of other lawsuits in federal court, so that's where our lawsuit sits right now. There is another lawsuit that was brought by the National Rifle Association, the Republican Party of New Mexico, and I think actually the Libertarian Party of New Mexico joined in as a party to that lawsuit as well. And they filed in state court and submitted a petition right to the state Supreme Court where they were heard. But their case really it's not a Second Amendment case, because, you know, the Second Amendment is in the United States Constitution. We do have a right to own a firearm under the state Constitution. But their case really is about the use of emergency powers and what you can and can't do with it. You know, I think one of the justices asked a good question of, you know, if we declare DUIs to be a public health emergency, can we ban driving? Things along that nature, because it's this governor, because she really was able to, you know, I'm getting a little out of my lane on this, do whatever she wanted through public health orders during COVID. You know, we did actually file a lawsuit against her on the public health orders in federal court back in 2020 when she tried to shut down gun stores. They had to do curbside service only, but the gun stores were still able to operate, and we filed a lawsuit over that. But she used them so heavily for several years during COVID that I think she got the idea that, you know, she could just do whatever she wanted on these orders, and she can just micromanage the state through public health orders. So that's kind of really what the case in the state Supreme Court is about, is, you know, what's the limitation of these health orders? Because, you know, New Mexico's legislature only meets either a 30-day session or 60-day session each year, depending on the year. So there's really up to the governor to do a lot of the work. And then the legislature did give the governor tremendous authority in these public health orders. And when that law was passed, I forget which year it was, but she used them so heavily and so extensively during COVID that now she's trying to branch out and get creative with them as well. And I think to some extent, from my perspective, it does seem that using this health order in this manner, in some ways, it was kind of giving up in a way, because it's not trying to effectively eradicate the Second Amendment, a federal constitutional right, through a health order. It was ludicrous. She knew it wasn't going to stand. I mean, she's not, she's a lawyer. She knew what was going to happen to that, but then I guess she was trying to like troll people or something like that, for lack of a better term. So it was disappointing, but also showed that, she's not, she's kind of given up on serious policymaking, and she's kind of throwing things at the wall that work because it might have worked on something in the past. So there's my soapbox on what's that. So basically, the law. So like I said, to kind of summarize real quick for your listeners, because I got a little off tangent, there. It's really about the ability of the governor to use the health orders to kind of enact large policy changes in state law. So that's what that lawsuit's about. It's an NRA, Republican Party, and I believe the Libertarian Party as well are parties to that suit.
Well, on the notes, since we are getting into the legislative session, it is, I think, within this governor's kind of wheelhouse to use and abuse executive authority and try to do things on her own. We saw that obviously with the public health emergency on guns. We saw that with the COVID public health emergency. But in other ways, we've seen her, as somebody who philosophically disagrees with the governor, it's easy to call her autocratic. But if you look at the way the governor handled the tax package last session, where you had Democrats in the legislature compiling tax provisions into the omnibus bill, only to see the governor veto, I believe it was 33 out of the 37 provisions in the bill of a policy proposal pushed by her own party and members of her own party. Just on that kind of thing alone, it's something that you think, gosh, maybe she should have been in the room or talking to these people and saying, hey guys, this is the direction I'd like to see this policy go. Clearly, her administration does not have much of a connection or ability to influence legislators, even of her own party, which, to take us to the legislative session, sort of bodes well, I guess, for their inability to get on the same page. Because ideologically, yes, you talk about rural Democrats, but, I'm just going to throw numbers out there. Maybe there's 5 in the House. Maybe there's 4 or 5 in the Senate. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but, that doesn't make them conservative. It just means that they are pro-gun Democrats, often from rural areas. They can still roll their policies through with majorities in both houses over those conservative, relatively conservative Democrats when it comes to guns, if they have something that they get buy-in from. And that's, I think, been the problem is for the Democrats is compiling the votes across the House, the Senate, and engaging the governor and helping to move that all forward. It's just a very, I guess, incompetent, or it's proven more difficult than I think people who disagree with them would believe it would be, right?
Yeah, and I think this governor, to talk to a little bit about the way everything ties together, she really does have kind of this micromanagerial style where she wants everything done exactly the way she wants it done, and gets kind of vindictive if it's not. So I think there's more problems kind of within how the governor kind of tries to navigate some of these policy items. I mean, if you see, like, particularly, I think one of the big issues this legislative session is going to be CYFD. CYFD is a terrible mess. It contributes greatly to the violence that we see in our state. It's gotten way worse under this governor. I mean, it wasn't great under Susana Martinez, but it's rapidly declined. It continues to decline. I mean, there's just a riot, I think, on Christmas Day at the Juvenile Detention Center where that CYFD runs, and the governor's being really quiet about it because she doesn't want to talk about what happened, what the conditions are like there right before the legislative session. But yeah, there's there's a lot of backroom politics that goes on in Santa Fe, as I'm sure anybody who lives in New Mexico is well aware that there's a lot of stuff like that going on. And I think this governor does have a problem building coalitions with members of her own party. And when where we can throw a wrench in there and say, this maybe isn't such a good idea, or peel some votes off here and there. That's how you ultimately kind of stop bills. It's I would love to be able to go into a committee and see a bad bill get shot down by a committee vote and killed decisively. A lot of times that doesn't happen in gun politics. Sometimes it's when a bill dies, a lot of times it's a slow death. It's, it goes through its first committee, people speak out against it. But you start building some questions around the bill. It still passes that committee, goes to the next committee, build more questions around it, passes that committee. But then it gets held up and never gets brought to the floor because you're able to chisel away enough at the bill and at the support of the bill that people say, this isn't something we want to do this year. So that's a lot of the reality of, the makeup of the legislature. It's Democrats basically have a super majority in the House and the Senate. So when you have a party that ideologically, in their official party platform, is taking a position against your side, you do have to be methodical in the way you work. You have to be sometimes surgical in the way you work. But at the same time, it can be done. But a lot of times we don't have those decisive victories that I think everyone would love to see. It's a marathon, not a sprint, because there's only one way to pass a bill, but a lot of ways to kill it.
Well, those are all fair points. I would call it the death by 1,000 cut strategy. And in a 30-day session, I think that is definitely the approach, because it may be a marathon in a way, but it's a very quick marathon by national legislative standards.
Yes.
When people from other states hear that we have a 30-day legislative session, they're often surprised.
We should make it a 15-day. They only need it's for passing the budget. That's what it's for. Pass the budget, go home. Make it 15 days. You don't need a 30-day. We can keep it shorter. We can make this more efficient. Save money. Save the environment. All these legislators don't have to keep driving to Santa Fe.
Oh, exactly.
We could save so much carbon emissions by moving it to a 15-day. Let's do a 30-day and a 15-day. Let's just do that.
Too much paper anyway. So, all right. So, what in order of kind of like the axis of biggest threat, most likelihood. Like, obviously, if somebody introduces a bill to eliminate the Second Amendment and ban all guns, that's not going anywhere. But give me the kind of sweet spot there of bills that you see as a real threat to the Second Amendment and individual gun rights, and that have a likelihood of passing. So I'll defer to you. What's the starting point as where we see things go in this session?
So great question. So I guess right as of the taping of this, we don't have a lot of the bill numbers for things that we believe are coming. The one anti-gun bill that we do know is coming that has been filed is 2024 House Bill 27, I believe is the number. Basically, that bill is proposing a bunch of changes to New Mexico's extreme risk protection order, a red flag gun confiscation law, whatever you want to call it, which was put into place, but it really hasn't been used. Which is something we said was going to happen based on the way the bill was written and things along that nature. But what they're trying to do now is they're trying to make it even easier for people to seek one of these orders. And one thing I want to make sure that we start with, to make sure everyone is well aware of, is that these orders are purely civil orders. There does not need to be any crime has taken place for one of these orders to be sought, nor you have to allege that a crime is going to happen, really. I mean, because it's a purely civil order, you are suspending people's constitutional rights under the state constitution and the United States Constitution to own and keep a firearm. So what they're trying to do with this is make it easier to pursue one of these orders, where a police officer or a healthcare provider could now be one of the people to file a petition. And they're also adding in a provision to add a search warrant to a purely civil order. So a police officer, actually, and one other thing they're doing in this is making it where a police officer can give the order to a judge verbally as opposed to in writing. So a police officer could go tell a judge they need to go search this person may commit a crime in the future. They need to go search their house, and the judge can basically give them a search warrant to a police officer just by themselves for this police officer to go to this person's house and search it for firearms and ammunition. I mean, rounds of ammunition are tiny. Where could that be hidden in a house? Literally anywhere. So there's some pretty serious civil liberty concerns with this bill. We don't really think that this bill, that the law has really been effective. We don't believe that there are adequate due process protections in this bill. And we may actually see something from the Supreme Court in the Rahimi case that was heard back in November that actually deals with due process in when you do suspend a constitutional right. I know it's a case that hasn't received as much attention because it's not so much a Second Amendment case as a due process case. But that case could have some pretty big implications depending on how the Supreme Court goes on it. I won't go too far down that tangent right now, but it is a case that we're very closely watching because it could actually potentially have some implications for New Mexico's domestic violence firearm relinquishment laws, as well as this red flag gun confiscation law. So that's
what's the number on that again?
House Bill 27.
And who are the sponsors?
I believe it's Chandler and Garrett.
Okay.
That's the names I have in my head. And Chandler is the chair of the House Judiciary, I believe. So, she has some influence, and the Attorney General, from my understanding, is the one who's been pushing this bill really hard because it's changes that he wants to see. And they are also changing up some language, clarifying some stuff. They don't fundamentally change the structure of how the law is, other than allowing police officers to do a lot of stuff just by themselves. That's probably the biggest change to this. So we have some very serious civil liberty concerns. We don't believe that this law we believe that this law does not adequately protect New Mexicans' due process rights to begin with, and this law would make those violations of due process worse. So that's a bill that we're going to be working on this session. That's the one that we know is filed. There's several more proposals that we know are coming. We believe that based on public statements that the governor and other legislators have made, we believe that a bill to basically ban the sale of new semi-automatic rifles and potential require registration of existing semi-automatic rifles is coming down the pipeline from Representative Romero, modeled after the bill that Senator Heinrich tried and failed to introduce at the federal levels. They're bringing that bill from the federal level down to the state level, where I believe Representative Romero out of Santa Fe has said she's going to introduce
and
that.
The governor was talking about that as well as something that she wanted to see happen. You're the gun expert. I'm trying to understand exactly what they're doing, but it's essentially they think they can force gun manufacturers to change the way guns operate, or really what they're doing is just making certain guns unattainable because that's not the way they work. I don't know
what they're trying to do is basically ban the sale of the most common rifles in New Mexico. Basically, a gun manufacturer would not be able to sell an AR-15 in New Mexico under this scheme because it bans the sale of new gas-operated semi-automatic rifles, which most semi-automatic rifles are gas-operated. There are some provisions in there about fixed magazines, things like that, but effectively it would just ban the sale of new AR-15s, AK-47s, and other semi-automatic rifles here in the state of New Mexico. So that's really what they're doing. They're not really telling people to change the way they manufacture it so much as just tell them you can't sell these rifles here.
And gas
operated I think it's like the gas operated semi-automatic rifle. It's like Heinrich called it the Go Safe Act or something along that nature, because it's talked about because basically when we talk about gas, because when the round is fired inside the chamber of the firearm, it releases a bunch of pressure that use that pressure to blow back the rifle to where it ejects the round, then loads the next round into the gun. So it's a semi-automatic. So you pull one bullet is expelled from the fire for every time you pull the trigger, and it uses gas pressure to kind of blow back the action of the firearm and then load the next round using gas and springs.
All right. Anything else that you see coming down the pipe in this session?
There's a couple other bills. There's a talk about raising the age to purchase a firearm. Most firearms to the age of 21, because currently you can purchase rifles and shotguns at the age of 18 through an FFL. You can actually acquire through a family member other firearms elsewise, but through an FFL, you can purchase rifles and shotguns at age 18. You have to wait till 21 for a handgun. But actually, Colorado passed that law, and there's currently a stay in place against the Colorado law from the 10th Circuit, which we're in. I believe we're in the 10th. So what that would theoretically mean is that if this law was passed, because there's a stay against Colorado law, it could potentially be really easy to get some kind of stay in New Mexico as well, because that stay is currently in place in Colorado, I believe. So that's another bill that we think may be coming. I think that's one bill they're talking about whether or not they're going to try and bring, because what happened in Colorado may have some bearing. I know they're also talking about a bill to make a waiting period where basically when you purchase a firearm at a store versus when you can take it home, there's a period between that, meaning you would go to the store, pay for your gun, do the background check, and then you'd have to wait a week or two before you get to take it home. That's another bill, because there are states like Hawaii. I think Hawaii is something like a 7-10 day waiting period. Some other states have waiting periods for handguns. I believe New Jersey has a waiting period for handguns. So that's another bill that they're looking at trying to do, where it's not necessarily banning you from purchasing a firearm, but requiring you to wait a period of time to before you can take the firearm home with you. So that's another bill they're talking about doing. And then we may also separately see something around the magazine capacity. Where currently New Mexico doesn't have laws around magazine capacity. Where they're talking about, setting the limit at 10 rounds, which would actually is smaller than a lot of handgun, particularly a normal handgun oftentimes has 12 to 15 round capacity, so it actually banned most handgun magazines, and so you'd have to buy special magazines for handguns, and also for rifles hold, because a standard magazine for an AR-15 or AK-47 for instance holds 30 rounds, so it would be banning a lot of magazines. That could be part of a semi-automatic rifle ban, or that could be a separate bill, but those are kind of the big ones we're looking at. We may also see something, a resurrection of the gun store liability, where basically they're amending New Mexico's Unfair Trade Practices Act to specifically target gun stores with much heavier penalties than any other industry, to try and make it where you could, to sue gun stores for the acts of someone for a firearm that made its way through their store. That's effectively what they're trying to do, to try and bankrupt gun stores, FFLs in New Mexico. That bill particularly, when it was introduced last year, really got the attention of a lot of gun stores who were maybe not as involved as they should have been in the legislative process, when they read this and realized that one lawsuit and we could be out of business. So they really got involved heavily, and I think it was great to see them kind of some gun stores who were not as involved as they should have been get more involved in the stuff in New Mexico, and we may see that bill again. But we don't have bill numbers for these different proposals, whether it be a semi-automatic rifle ban, a magazine ban, 14-day waiting period, or gun store liability bill. But they may be coming. I think there's a lot of politics going on right now to decide what they're going to try to do. We anticipate they're going to push the Attorney General. He's been behind that House Bill 27, the concept. He's been pushing out in the media for a while. We think he's going to be pushing really hard, and that's where I think a lot of the fight's going to be this legislative session. I think that's a bill we're looking at that has the potential to get passed if people don't get involved and we don't work on this bill. And at the same time, I would hope that we could build a broad coalition of civil liberty-minded individuals on that, just because the huge implications of a police officer being able to execute a search warrant under a purely civil order, where no crime has to take place for the search warrant, for very small objects could be executed, because we're not talking about executing a search warrant for someone's vehicle. It's where could they reasonably put a vehicle? They're probably not putting it in their living room. Whereas where could you put a round of ammunition? Literally anywhere.
Yeah. So right now, as we approach the session, as we record this conversation, there's a lot of discussion going on behind closed doors among Democrats who, understanding that we're dealing with a 30-day session, want to deliver something that they can say, I'm, restricting gun rights and, complying with the left-wing base on these issues, but also understanding that it is a short session, that a lot of these policies, quite frankly, are illegal and unconstitutional, will be challenged, and may not be enforceable in general. I mean, red flag laws, particularly, like you mentioned, it obviously could set up that situation where you have police officers ransacking houses to go searching for various things. But in reality, most police officers are probably not super keen to go and do that. So how does I hate to be so kind of blunt about it, but how does reality kind of make what they are trying to do difficult? I mean, there's obviously politics, but kind of like my organization's fights against electric vehicles and mandating them, there's just a certain amount of reality, legal reality, and then just reality that gets in the way of some of the ardent desires of the gun grabbers?
So that's a great question. I think first and foremost, there is no database of guns in New Mexico. We don't know who owns them. There's theoretically the ATF. The ATF has a lot of records on who purchased the firearm at the initial purchase, but then a lot of times things get really fuzzy because they have to keep those records as paper records. So the state of New Mexico doesn't have like a database of guns.
Which, real quick, is like the joke that you see sometimes on social media, like, I was in a tragic boating accident and all my guns are now at the bottom of the lake or whatever. You get those people posting those kinds of things, and that's kind of what they're making fun of, right?
Yes, is a little tongue-in-cheek way of kind of pointing out the fact there is no database of firearms. If they require people to register their semi-automatic rifles, well, they have no idea who has them or doesn't have them. And actually, so the state of Illinois recently passed a law around banning sale of new semi-automatic rifles and requiring registration of currently owned ones. It appears that based on the statistics we've seen of number of people who have registered them, that probably less than 1% of people are actually complying with registering their semi-automatic rifles in the state of Illinois, because no one knows who has them. I personally, in maybe a little bit different spot than a lot of other people, because I've signed a lot of sworn statements and court testimony testifying that I own firearms. Yeah. So I have to be a little bit more careful, because I've repeatedly told the federal government in sworn testimony that I've made firearms myself. I own firearms, so I have to be careful with what I do personally. But there is no database of this stuff. We've made, I think that's for the best, and we ensure to keep, and we want to make sure we keep it that way. So in terms of registering stuff, there's no ability to know who actually has registered stuff. On this background check bill they did a number of years ago, it does not appear there's been any enforcement of it because it's impossible to know, basically. Once that gun initially leaves the FFL, when it starts changing hands, no one knows what happens to it. And when they go to someone, where'd you get this gun? Well, they say, it fell off the back of a truck. That type answer. So there's a lot of practical things dealing with this. And then actually on, these red flag laws, there's a question of, because it's a civil order and it's when police officers go to execute these search warrants, their ability, what kind of tactical teams do they show up with? What kind of stuff do they do? Because it's just a purely civil order. I think there's a lot of things that they have to work through on that, because, what police officers going in to confiscate firearms when you believe someone is armed and dangerous is one of the most dangerous things they can do. That's why they bring it. That's why they have all this, heavy tactical equipment that police departments in America to have today. So there's a lot of things like, are we going to be putting police officers in this situation? And if you have someone who's in distress, is sending a SWAT team to their door to take away their guns and leave them there the best thing to do? I would say no, it's not. So there's a lot of, when in bringing these laws to actual reality, I think there's a lot of challenges, because a lot of this stuff you can only charge someone with after the fact. If you catch people and then they admit to what they're doing, or you have some kind of really hard evidence, you can really only catch them after the fact, because there's no way to preemptively make sure that people are doing background checks and private firearm sales. There's no way of doing that because there's no database of firearms and people aren't immediately reporting changes in ownership anyway. So there's a lot of practical challenges to this stuff. I mean, with these different firearm relinquishment laws, how do you know someone's actually surrendered all their firearms? Well, if they're not talking to you, you really don't have any way of knowing if they've actually surrendered their firearms or not. You can do a search warrant for their house. What if they have a firearm at their friend's house? Do you have a search warrant for that friend's house too? But that's a lot of, some of the questions we're going to have to start asking ourselves. And on these domestic violence, that's a problem that's been persisted for years in these domestic violence firearm relinquishment is have people actually surrendered all their firearms? Well, if they don't know, because a lot of times these people subject to these orders not necessarily the most truthful individuals in the world, so you have a problem dealing with them on that. So there's a lot of practical applications when you have this particularly the distrust people have for government. I think that's one of the things that people on the anti-gun left just don't understand, is just the amount of distrust, for a very good reason, that people have of government, and why some of these laws are going to have such a hard time enforcing them, because you have to have people willingly buy in to make these laws work, and people are not going to buy in. In fact, if anything, you see with the governor trying to micromanage people's lives, people are not buying in. People are going the opposite direction on this stuff. So there's no trust of government in this among gun owners and among non-gun owners too, to be very blunt. So these laws are not going to work. It's going to be a lot of flailing about, doing stuff that never gets enforced, like what we've seen with the background check bill, and so on and so forth.
Well, and just another kind of anecdote or reality getting in the way is, I can't tell you how many times I drive around town here in Albuquerque and I see automobiles with no license displayed, not license plates on the vehicle. And that's a relatively uncontroversial issue. You might get an occasional, super diehard libertarian, who's like philosophically opposed to licensing their vehicle in the state. But these people drive down the road and seemingly are unmolested by the police, given the number of them and the relative impunity with which they drive around. So, guns is a whole different level of intrusion and kind of, I think people have a lot more philosophical revulsion to the kinds of policies that you're talking about. So just another kind of way that reality intrudes on some of these best laid plans. So any other issues coming up in the session that you think people need to be concerned about in this 30-day?
I think that kind of covers it. We may not see all of those bills introduced. I think we are going to see, I strongly suspect we're going to see some version of a rifle ban introduced. They tried for one last year. It died on the House floor when it never got brought up for a vote, as I believe where it died. So there's going to be these bills. They're going to be coming in pretty fast. They may not file them immediately because I think they're still doing a lot of figuring out what exactly the language is going to be and who's going to be carrying the bill. Probably just as important as anything else, because these bills are going to attract a lot of attention, and that's something they don't necessarily want in a 30-day session when they're trying to move really fast on a lot of different issues. So I would say the real battle lines are going to be on House Bill 27. What direction are we going to go with due process rights in New Mexico? And then also, what firearms do you have the right to own? And can the governor arbitrarily decide what's on and off a list? Because effectively under this scheme, it gives the government the authority to kind of say here's what's on the list, here's what's not on the list, because there's some vagueness in these definitions. So do we really want the NMDPS secretary deciding what guns you can and can't own, and then also kind of registration stuff? Do you trust the state of New Mexico to register your firearms with them when they've shown themselves they've had some pretty big data breaches? Department of Regulation and Licensing had a pretty major data breach. Bernalillo County had a major data breach. Albuquerque Public Schools had a major data breach. Like, do you trust the state of New Mexico with this information about your firearms when they've shown that they are not as cyber secure as they should be?
Yeah, I guess that's another aspect of it is just the idea that they are going to physically have to track this information somewhere. And, we see even the biggest and most theoretically competent corporations who have a strong incentive to keep this information private, have their leaks. And government, we know they have all kinds of different incentives, and you get one bad actor in a government agency somewhere. Heaven forbid, I'm sure Michelle Lujan Grisham would never have such a person working in that type of organization, dealing with this very sensitive data that they would somehow oops and release it. So, yeah, a lot of concerns to be had. So let's just give out your organization's information. If people want to engage on gun rights issues, how can they do that? Is it through your website, or do they have to be on your email list? How can they be involved with gun rights in the session?
That is a great question. So you can go to our website, nmssa.org, right now and sign up for our free email alerts. We will be sending out information pretty close to real time on what's happening with these different bills. When these bills get filed, we'll put out information on it. We will put out, here's the highlights of what the bill you need to know about. Here's where the bill currently sits. We put that information out through email. That's one of our really big things. So I encourage everyone. Those email alerts are completely free. You do not need to be a member, a donor, or anything like that to get those email alerts. We are also on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and X, as I guess it's now called. It's not Twitter anymore, it's X. So I'm trying to get used to saying that. So we will also be putting out information in real time, pretty close to real time there on social media as well, like on Facebook, Instagram, and X as New Mexico Shooting Sports Association or NM Shooting Sports Association. So we want everyone to be involved in this, because the more people we get involved is when we're able to be more effective. Because what we saw last year on some of these bills is when you get people involved who may not even be registered to vote in New Mexico, and they're calling their state representative saying, I don't really know what I'm doing. I own my firearms for hunting or whatever. I live up here in northern Rio Arriba County, but I don't want you to vote against this bill, because if you don't, I'm going to actually register to vote and go vote against you. That gets people's attention. When we can get those gun owners who are not normally involved engaged, because we want every gun owner, you don't even have to be a gun owner, to get involved in this stuff, because hopefully you can see that even if you don't care about the Second Amendment, you can see how the governor has overstepped her constitutional authority on these issues. And if she does it on this issue, she'll do it on your issue too. So that's the message we want to get to people. If she's allowed to do whatever she wants on guns, she will do it to your issue too, whether that be free speech, whether that be, economic issues, so on and so forth. She will come after your issue with the same approach too, if she gets away with it on this. So we need everyone to get involved, even if you're not necessarily a gun person or Second Amendment person. So, we need to respect civil liberties. We need to respect constitutional rights. And these bills that they're introducing, we strongly believe do not do that. And we're currently in the courts pursuing litigation against the governor. We've done so in the past. And based on what happens in the legislature, we may have to do so again in the future, but it is far, far better to stop something in the legislature. So go to our website, nmssa.org, sign up for free email alerts, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and X, and get involved, because we need everyone to be.
All right. Thank you, Zach. And thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointsnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to the show at Apple, Stitcher, or tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.